Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today, we're joined by the president and CEO of Moosehead Breweries, Mr. Andrew Oland. Andrew's the sixth generation of Olands to lead the brewery, which is the last major brewery in Canada to still be family-owned. He's a Harvard-educated businessman who's also the chair of the Economic Development, Greater Saint John, which helps attract businesses to Saint John, New Brunswick, where Moosehead is headquartered and where he's joining us from today. So, Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mitch. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
Yeah. So first thing I want to do, just before we get into any of the policy topics that we're going to have a conversation today, it's worth noting what I mentioned off the top in the intro, which was Moosehead is independent, it's family owned, sixth generation of family ownership, not something you see among the major brewers. In fact, on the website, you clearly list you're the last major brewer to be owned by Canadians instead of corporate ownership. You managed to be that way for some 150 years now. So it's a really interesting history, and I hope we hear a bit more about it. But why is that so unique? Why don't other major brewers have that? And how does that sort of impact your day-to-day decision-making?
Yeah, so in Canada right now, there's about 1,000 breweries. And of those 1,000 breweries, 4 have a business in every province in Canada. So they sell in all provinces. They have people in all provinces. And of those 4, Moosehead is very proud to be one of them. The other 3, Labatt, Molson, and Sleeman, are all Canadian divisions of multinationals. So we consider Canada's only truly Canadian brewery. And really, the story of Moosehead starts in 1865 when Susanna Oland moved with her 11 children from England to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And shortly thereafter, in 1867, the year of our country's formation, she started selling the beer that she was brewing in the backyard, a Brown October Ale. And then the history goes from there. It's a history of overcoming adversity, very similar to Canada's history, if you think of the ups and downs that we've had. And I would say that we do have, I think there's probably 2 things that might separate us. One is we definitely have a long-term perspective in terms of the decision-making that we're doing. And then the second thing would be, we're actively working on how this business goes into Generation 7. It's not easy. It's not a slam dunk by any means, but actively working so that that is an opportunity.
Well, let's talk a bit about that plan into the future, because you mentioned the breweries overcome adversity a number of times. We're here to talk about the beer industry, where it's at today, the challenges it's facing. One of those has to be the pandemic, obviously a unique circumstance. So a year ago, the pandemic hits Canada. Bars and restaurants start to shut down all across the country with little to no warning. There's no advanced planning that tells you this is coming. It just kind of happens. What's the immediate impact of the pandemic on your operations?
So the immediate impact would be similar to any other manufacturer in Canada. Send as many people as you can to work from home, and then make sure that every operation in the brewery, individuals are able to stay 6 feet apart and be socially distant, and implementing, I'll call those COVID protocols. And so very proud of the team here, and in particular, just how quickly the team reacted. And then what we were facing was, so what we call our on-premise business, so our bars and restaurants, they're a big part of our business. They're about 20% of our business. For some breweries in Canada, they'd be up to 50, 60, 70% of the breweries. So they just stopped. So we had a situation where we had all these kegs in inventory that we had brewed in anticipation of future sales, as well as customers returning kegs, which they had purchased, and we allowed them to return anything that wasn't tapped. So it was a full keg. And so we had to deal with all these excess kegs. And then at the same time, we saw a significant change in our mix going from on-premise to retail sales. And that is more and more in Canada becoming cans versus bottles. And so that put pressure on, first of all, our canning equipment, but even more importantly than that, just securing cans. And there's been a shortage of cans in Canada, North America, for the last couple of years. And then it's been accelerated with COVID. And just on the can situation, what's happening is really sort of three things. One is just beers becoming more popular in cans. Also, soft drinks are becoming more popular in cans as consumers move away from plastic. And then with COVID, consumers were moving from, if you think about all the pop that would have been consumed when someone went to a Subway or a McDonald's or a Burger King, what we call fountain pop, that all went to the home consumer. And then third, you get this growth of carbonated or soda water, bubbly type waters like bubbly. And so just tremendous pressure on cans. And so like every other business in Canada, we had to adjust to those realities.
So you're facing a shortage in the we'll call it the vessel that you deliver your product in the cans. You've got a return of kegs en masse. You've got a bunch of beer that you thought was going to be sold that might no longer be sold, or at least in the way that you envisioned. You know, on top of that, beer is very heavy to ship, right? So all of these times that you've got to ship or return is quite expensive, makes a big decision. How do you not raise your prices? What was the impact on pricing as a result of the pandemic? And like, how difficult is it as a business to make a decision about prices and what consumers expect?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I mean, you know, you have to be raising your prices over time as a business because your costs, your input costs, continue to increase, whether that's energy, whether that's employee wages, and the list goes on. And then in Canada, so this may surprise some of your listeners, but in the United States, the average tax on a case of beer in the United States, so 24 cans, is $4. In Canada, it's $20 a case. So it's 5 times, and that's a combination of provincial and federal taxes, and the US numbers are state and federal taxes. So upwards of 55% of the beer price in some Canadian provinces is taxed. And so price increases are a challenge in that environment. Plus, and this is something that I just find amazing, Bill Morneau's first budget, he increased the federal escalator, the federal tax on beer by inflation every year, April 1st, regardless of sort of the environment. So we're in the middle of the pandemic. The pandemic's just started, and the federal government puts a tax increase on beer. And that's a tax increase which has to be absorbed on the brewers. We've been advocating to have that tax frozen. So far, we've not been successful. So on Thursday, the tax on beer is going to go up again, unless something happens this week, which is very disappointing.
So the escalator tax, I know it's something that when I was in the Premier's office in Ontario, we paused because there was a provincial version as well. Maybe that's where the federal government got the idea. Who knows? But pause that on the understanding that there were, at that time, we were contemplating significant changes to the retail space, right? To beer and wine and corner stores, and thought, okay, not a good time to tax the industry when we make them go through a transformation that may or may not benefit all of them, right? There'd be some players that could be worse for, and some that could be better for. Here you have an international pandemic, which is clearly more of a consequence than the retail change that we were contemplating at the time, and you still have the number go up. You know, I was reading on the Beer Canada site that it's almost $14 billion of GDP the beer industry contributes, and some 149,000 jobs directly and indirectly, both, you know, breweries and your operations and bars and restaurants and that sort of thing. So is that the economic case? The economic case is pause the tax, create jobs, help with Canada's economic recovery. Yeah,
I think it's a manufacturer's tax, and we got manufacturer's tax in Canada like 40 years ago. So if the government wants to increase the tax on beer every year, put it out there front and center. Don't try to hide behind brewers. Just put it out there somehow in you know, the HST component of it. But we have to absorb this tax and then figure out how we're going to get it back. And it's also, you know, it's sort of unintended consequences. Most tax increases, or all tax, have to go through Parliament. This one doesn't. It was approved once by Parliament. And the reason tax increases have to go through Parliament is because do you really want to put a tax increase in the middle of a pandemic, which is what the government ended up doing last April and looks like they're going to do this April.
Well, we call the podcast intended consequences to make sure that we're talking about policy decisions that achieve the outcome they're designed to achieve. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, just on that point, I think one of the things that that COVID has highlighted is the importance of having domestic industries, and we've seen that where we didn't frankly didn't have a domestic PPE industry in a lot of areas. Obviously, we don't have domestic vaccine production, and I'm not in any way saying that the beer industry is the same as PPE or vaccines, but 85% of the beer that's consumed in this province, in this country, is brewed in this country. It is a true success story. And as government, you should be looking at nurturing any domestic industries, at minimum, not trying to hurt them. And I think there's a lot of areas that government, particularly the federal government and the beer industry, can work together on. I'll give you an example. I talked about the growth of cans. Well, the 473, or the larger can, there's currently no domestic production of that can in Canada. They're all imported from the US. Ours come from Mississippi, of all places, which doesn't make sense. And to me, you have can companies that want to make investments. They see the growth of cans coming and continuing. And to me, that's just an example where the federal government and brewers could work together.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think this is, we get into a further policy space here, because there's this sort of love-hate relationship with governments and alcohol industries, or these sorts of things, where they appreciate the tax revenue and the jobs and the economic growth, but then at the same time they go out there and they don't really want to encourage people to consume. So they always kind of find themselves in this tricky spot. And where they normally take it out, sometimes obviously on taxation at 50% a can, that seems like they've been taking it out on taxation for some time, but they can also do it on the regulatory side. So you mentioned that cans are growing in importance and in consumer demand. Recycling's always kind of been something that people associate with the beer industry, returning their bottles and what have you. But there's new environmental regulations that are coming for packaging as well, I believe. So what are the challenges that those pose for you and your business too?
Yeah, what's happening is, as we've been speaking about, is the industry standard bottle, that brown bottle, is declining in volume each year as cans grow. And a portion of cans are sold in what's called a high cone wrap. So if you think about, you buy a 6-pack and there's the plastic wrap over the cans to keep them together. And for the beer industry is completely supportive of moving on from the high cone. We know the environmental issues with high cone, and particularly the damage it does to wildlife. The challenge that we have is just the timeline. So that, again, in the midst of a pandemic, the federal government came out and said high cone was going to be banned in Canada by the end of this calendar year. And that presents significant issues for brewers, because we have to figure out what we call SKUs, stock keeping units. So those SKUs of high cone, we're going to have to put them in something else to get those cans to the retailer and ultimately the consumer, most likely boxboard paper. And so we've gone back to the government. We've said, look, we're fully supportive of getting out a high cone, but we need 3 to 5 years to do it. We have to refit our breweries, which involves purchasing new equipment. Before you do that, you have to design the space in the brewery. You have to visit some suppliers. It's not practical right now to even leave Canada. And so, and again, a well-meaning effort by government, but a timeline that is just too aggressive and is going to cause harm to industry and ultimately to consumers. Well,
and it's one thing if the pandemic was as short as we all kind of thought it might be at the start or hoped it was, right? We're all thinking, I remember buying some groceries and thinking 2 weeks, a month, no big deal. And here we are a year in, we've still got some runway left for sure. So this has been a fundamental change to the business model, not just sort of a blip or a thought that you'll look back on. So how has that business model changed? I mean, you mentioned cans have increased and probably increased more as retail sales pick up. Are Canadians buying more beer on the individual level, but less overall because of the closure in bars and restaurants? Or what's the consumer behavior changes as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, so overall beer sales are down slightly versus the previous, if you want to do 2020 versus 2019 or on a government fiscal year, which is just concluding. So overall sales are just down slightly. And on-premise, so bar and restaurant sales, I mean, it varies across each province in terms of where provinces are and cities are in lockdown, but you're down 50, 60, 70% in terms of the bar and restaurant. And most, but not all of that has gone to retail sales. And you're also, obviously last summer, no festivals, no concerts, none of that traditional beer selling events. And, that's our expectation going forward for most of 2021. The way we talk about it here is we should be back in business for hockey season. So if you think about sort of an October, November, I think you can envision a world where Canadians are going back to the hockey rink, whether it's to watch the Maple Leafs or the Saint John Sea Dogs here in Saint John. But I think that the festival scene, concerts, those type of things will be limited throughout the summer of 2021.
Totally fair. They could go see the Halifax Mooseheads, which,
and they could also go see the Halifax.
You'd be supportive of.
Yes.
So I'm also curious about, because, there's this kind of saying out there that pandemics changed everything, right? Nothing will ever be the same. People always talk about that kind of thing. In consumer behavior with beer, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. You've mentioned the retail side has kind of picked up for some of the losses in the commercial side. I'm curious about the types of beers that people are consuming. I noticed, in 2009, you launched Crack Canoe, which is sort of a lighter offering. Is there a heavier demand? I guess that's a weird way to put it, but is there a heavier demand for light beers in Canada these days?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that, what we call in the industry, the ultra low alcohol beers. So this would be 3.5% or less. And Crack Canoe is our entry in that category. You would also have brands such as Michelob Ultra and Sleeman Clear. So those are all growing. And incidentally, we have taken a proposal to the federal government to reduce the taxes on beers below 3.5%. The idea is encouraging Canadians to drink beers with a little less alcohol in them. And so we're optimistic that will be viewed favorably by the federal government. The other thing we're seeing in the beer category would just be continued growth of sort of innovation and the consumer's desire for innovation and retailers' excitement around that. Smaller brewers in Canada have been affected by the closure of the bars and restaurants because they sell a fair amount to those entities, but also a lot of them tend to have their own tap rooms, which are both a portion of their volume and their profits. And so those will start to come back, I assume, this summer. Slowly.
And I want to get into the sort of the craft beer surge in a quick second, but while we're on the topic of the different types of products, I'm curious, is the legalization of cannabis presented an opportunity? Are these seen as, because I know when it was about to be legalized, talking to the beer industry a lot and in my role in government, there was a lot of concern that it could be a competitive offering. I'm curious if that's sort of played out, and even is there opportunity there for collaboration in the future?
So it's definitely a competitor to beverage alcohol. Cannabis is. The reality is cannabis has been in Canada for very many years, and now it's legal. So it's probably easier to see and easier to acquire. The interesting thing just on cannabis is the taxes on cannabis are a lot less than the taxes on beer. Which I find slightly ironic. And of course, the reason that is because the legal entities that are competing with, that are selling cannabis have to compete with a thriving black market. And if they're not priced accordingly, then the black market will win. And so that's the situation there. In terms of beer and cannabis, it's currently illegal to brew beer or any other beverage alcohol and cannabis and a cannabis product or grow cannabis in the same facility. And it's also illegal, not just in Canada, but in North America, to combine any form of beverage alcohol and cannabis for, I think, obvious public health reasons. That's something that we would fully support. We are looking at the cannabis space. We're intrigued by the cannabis space, but we're still looking at it, and it's still very much an industry in its infancy. You have to remember, yes, we've gone through prohibition in one form or another, but the rules around beverage alcohol have been in place for, well, since we've been a country. And the rules around cannabis have only been in place for, I think, is it 3 years now? So it's
lots of kinks to work out still.
Yeah, there's lots of kinks to work out.
For sure. So let's pick back up on the craft brewery portion that you mentioned, because notice obviously you're probably more similar in the style, being family owned and independent, to a craft brewery, obviously much larger than a craft brewery, but you're also on the economic development. You chair the economic development in Greater Saint John. And so I see a bit of a trend here, which is that for me, one of the reasons that craft brewery is so interesting, especially in its surge lately, is they happen to bring jobs to towns that don't have a lot of economic activity. You need to be next to flowing water of some capacity is normally the thing you look for. And that means you're not in downtown Toronto. You could be out in rural or northern parts and what have you. So there's a real interesting push there. And between 2018 and 19, Canada saw the number of craft breweries rise year over year by almost 13%. That's a big jump. There's a lot of people getting into space, but they're also competitors. So why do you think craft breweries have become much more common in recent years, even in what you've already described as pretty much like an ultra competitive environment?
Yeah, I think that craft brewers or small brewers are just super for the beer industry. I think it's exposing consumers to a whole bunch of new styles and just to the brilliance that I think is beer. And I'm obviously very biased, but I think beer is the best beverage out there. and so smaller brewers have done a great job, I would say. In particularly with the beer experience. And if you think about the ability to go into their tap rooms and talk to knowledgeable servers and sometimes the brewer or brewmaster. So the whole beer education piece, they deserve a lot of credit for. And that's really create excitement around the beer category. And then because they're operating much smaller breweries than a Moosehead or even my bigger competitors, they can afford to take more risks. We have 3 brew houses here at Moosehead, a very small one, a couple of kegs, a bigger one, it's about 80 kegs, and then a larger one, which is almost 1,000 kegs when we do a batch. And I joke, look, if we do something and we mess up and we've got 40 or 50 kegs or something, that's no problem. I just got a lot of extra friends. If we mess up and I got 800 or 900 kegs or something, then you got a real problem. Right. And so credit to the small brewers. I will say this, and this is uniquely Canadian, is every province in Canada subsidizes one way or another their small brewers, typically through a reduced markup. And so if you sell in your home province, essentially, the entity that's buying your beer is giving you a higher price because they're charging less taxes on it. So it's sort of, unfortunately, typical Canada is we have about 1,000 of these small brewers, but very few of them actually travel outside their own province, because there's preferential treatment in their province, but it means when they go to someone else's province, there's preferential treatment for the local brewers there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because when I was doing some research for the episode, I came across a stat that 94% of breweries in Canada are operating locally and producing under 15,000 hectoliters annually. I don't know if many people listening to the podcast are going to know what a hectoliter is organically, but that's not a lot of beer. Let's just put it that way, right? So to your point about getting that sort of local operating incentive and local tax incentive or markup incentive, it really is there. Is there a challenge for the Canadian beer industry to grow, not just domestically across provincial borders, but internationally across other borders outside of the country?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting when, when folks, from time to time, particularly, politicians will be somewhere and pre-COVID, and they would say, "Oh, Andrew, we've signed CETA, the European Free Trade Agreements," and I'm like, "Okay, that's great." And we do sell some beer in Europe, not very much, and you have to be careful with, I'll call it what we call non-tariff barriers. But part of my response to them is, look, I'm still trying to figure out, we have a lot more opportunity to sell beer in Calgary.
Mm-hmm.
Let alone Germany or something like that. And there are across this country in beverage alcohol, there are a number of barriers that still exist, and the essence of them, or where they come from, is that coming out of Prohibition, beverage alcohol was clearly a provincial responsibility, and the provinces had three objectives. One was the whole social responsibility side. The second was maximize the tax revenue. But then third was maximize economic development and the impact of the industry. And so you would have rules that say, in fact, in the late 1970s, we were selling beer in the Maritimes, and we were exporting to the US far before we were selling beer in Quebec or Ontario or Western Canada, because it was just far easier to get our product to market.
Yeah, I remember when Premier Ford had just gotten elected, one of the first things that we did was we had to go to the Premier's Conference in St. Andrews by the Sea in New Brunswick. And when there, Premier Pallister in Manitoba brought like a 6-pack of a local brewery and put it on the table and kind of said to the premiers, like, what I just did was illegal. Like, I brought it across the provincial borders and said, like, here's a beer, and you can't find this in your provinces, but wanted you to have it. It's interesting because obviously it's a great way of illuminating the interprovincial barriers that exist. But it's interesting, if you went back to that craft brewery and said, "Hey, I fixed the barriers, you can sell in Ontario," they might say, "No, we're good."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
So
no, that's you hit the nail on the head, Mitchell. I mean, it's or maybe they'll be like, "Well, we got to go to Saskatchewan first, right?
right.
It's a little closer and all that type of stuff."
Yeah. So one of the things I do want to touch on as we get sort of closer to the end of the episode, only a couple questions or so left, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the different retail experiences in each province, right? So we've got fully government run liquor stores in Nova Scotia. We've got fully privatized in Alberta. We've got weird mixes in BC. We've got the beer store conglomerate in Ontario. As somebody who operates in these spaces, it doesn't necessarily have ownership share in the same way that some of the major multinationals do. Is there a preferred retail system for you in any of these provinces that's given you the best experience?
So one of the things I think your listeners have to understand is, in most provinces, not in all, but in most provinces, the provincial government is taking the profit margin as both the retailer and the wholesaler of beverage alcohol, and that's not being the private sector doesn't take that, and that's a big amount of money, and so that's the root cause of why there's been I'll call it this very slow evolution in terms of. And so to me, it's about balance. If you're going to take an Ontario situation, if you're going to add 6, 7, 8,000 new outlets that sell beer, well, you're going to increase your costs of distribution, and someone has to pay for that. And it's either going to be the brewer, it's going to be the government, or the consumer. And we talked earlier about the pressure on brewer margins, so we're reluctant. There are a number of provinces that have a nice mix of having, I'll call government-run liquor stores in more urban areas, and then in rural areas, they would have agents, which would be convenience stores, gas stations, which offer beer, wine, and spirits, same price as the government stores. And one of the things you have to understand too about the government stores is they've evolved a lot in the last 20 years in terms of the shopper experience, the quality of fixtures, the amount of inventory, the knowledge level of the staff, even the hours they're open. And that's just all social norms, right? If you go back 30 years ago, you couldn't have a liquor store open on Sunday, it couldn't be open after 6, like the list goes on and on. So we are getting better in that way. One of the things that concerns me is often when provinces want to consider going to a retail, I'll call it a private sector retail model, they still want to keep their cash flow.
Right.
And the only way they can do that is sell off the whole entity. So then you go from a government monopoly, which is not a great thing, to the only thing worse, which is a private sector monopoly. And so I would be very against a private sector monopoly.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I know when we were looking at the issue and Premier Ford had made the campaign promise about beer and wine in corner stores, one of the things that came up pretty regularly was, if you're going to have private retailers, you might have to take a look at this uniform pricing model, because it's kind of tough to say you have to have the exact same margins as the beer store, as the LCBO, because people who buy a loaf of bread in a convenience store know that it costs a little bit more than a loaf of bread in the grocery store, but they're getting the convenience aspect. That's why they go pay the extra $1 or whatever it might be. It seems to me one of the takeaways from the episode here is that the beer industry is sort of mired in a lot of government intervention, be it on what price you can sell for, what your taxation level is, the regulations that you're constrained by. So am I correct in saying, if there was a takeaway for listeners, be them civil servants, political staffers, what have you, is let you be a bit more like a private business and a little bit more like a government entity?
Yes, and the other would be, watch for unintended consequences. Because sometimes when you make a change here, it can have a big change over here. And so please consult and engage with industry, and we'll get to a better place together.
Yeah, well, I think that message has come through loud and clear today. So Andrew, really appreciate you coming on the program, and thanks for taking out the time of your busy day to do this.
Mitch, a real pleasure. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time.